Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard Rebecca Borkowski and John Miller testify. You saw their demeanor both immediately after the shooting as well as on the stand at trial. Both Rebecca and John testified that the defendant, Joshua Aide, showed up at Rebecca's home and almost immediately began shooting them. They said it at the scene, they said it at the hospital, and they said it at this trial. Their statements have been consistent and credible. Everything they testified to is supported by the evidence you saw in this case. All three of Rebecca's neighbors testified to a quick succession of popping sounds. All three of Rebecca's neighbors testified that they heard no disturbance prior to hearing that popping sound. Ryan Gerard Johnson is so close to Rebecca's home that she shares a driveway with Rebecca. She testified that she was in a room on the southwest side of her home. She testified that she could hear Rebecca playing music as Rebecca and her guests were outside. Ryan heard no disturbance in that driveway prior to the pop-pop sound that drew her to the window, where she then saw the defendant standing behind the white car in the driveway. Both Rebecca and John have been completely cooperative at all stages of this investigation. John Miller provided a map of where he and Rebecca were standing when the defendant walked up to them that night. His map also shows you where the defendant was standing when he fired the Ruger 380 at Rebecca's head. Both John and Rebecca have testified to those locations, and their testimony has been consistent. Rebecca's wound to the right side of her head and the pooled blood from where she fell in the garage is consistent with both Rebecca and John's testimony. She was facing the Tahoe. She testified that the defendant's gun failed to fire initially, and she turned to get away. She was shot in the right side of the head. The map also shows John Miller's path of travel. That's his path of travel there as he fled the defendant, going from the back of the car, around the front, through the neighbors' yards, ultimately to Dan Schrader's residence, where he burst in and asked Dan to call 911. The location of the bullet jacket in the concrete seam on the northwest corner of Rebecca's home indicates that the defendant, while standing where John had drawn that X, fired at John as he fled around the white car. That's also consistent with where he was standing, according to what Ryan Gerard Johnson testified to, that when she looked out her window upon hearing that pop-pop sound, she saw the defendant standing behind the white car. Now, we know that jacket is the jacket from the bullet that went through the right side of John's face and out the left side. We know that because the other two bullets were lodged in the heads of the other two victims. That was the one bullet that passed through a victim. When we look at the next shot, this is also consistent. This is a still shot from the video you saw that Detective Robertson had taken the day after the incident. This would be from approximately the position that the defendant was standing when he traced John around the vehicle and shot him as he was coming around the corner of that vehicle. And that's how the bullet jacket ended up in that scene there. John testified that he was shot in the right side of his face. We could just go back to the last one. John testified that he was shot in the right side of his face with a bullet exiting the left side. Again, this is consistent with him coming around this car on this path, being shot in the right side of the face with a bullet exiting to the left. That is also consistent with the exhibit you heard John read, which is his certified medical records. indicating the bullet entered the right side of his face and exited the left side. The blood droplets in Rebecca's grass and on her neighbor's driveway also support John's statement of the path he took in search of help. All those blood droplets came back to John. Now, looking at this picture here and what the defendant testified to, it doesn't make any sense. So, defendant testified that he's about where the X is. John is up there, kind of where the J is, when he comes running this way and is already in a path of travel. If you were to take the defendant's version as true, John would have had to have been shot in the left side of the face as he's running this way. That's not what happened. That's not what his medical records say. That's not what he testified to. This is what matches the evidence on the scene. The other thing that doesn't add up about the defendant's statement is that this gun that Rebecca allegedly had was just tossed under a table in the garage. Now, you saw Rebecca's condition when officers came upon her in the garage. She was in no condition to run around hiding weapons, coming up with a scheme with John as he was running around somewhere else. That's simply not credible. She was so confused, she couldn't even identify where and what exactly her injury was. You saw her struggle to get up. You saw her waver as an officer tried to walk her out onto the driveway. It's simply not credible that Rebecca had the capacity, after being shot in the head by the defendant, to run around hiding weapons in the garage. The fact that there was no weapon on Rebecca is also consistent with what the detectives testified to. They thoroughly searched that garage. They were looking for the casing that at the time they got there was under the toolbox. They were also looking for the bullet that had gone through John Miller's face. They searched that garage thoroughly. There was no weapon located in the garage. And all of Rebecca's guns are accounted for as being inside the home. She has 5. 4 were located during the search. The 5th was located by her aunt. Her aunt is completely credible. Her reason for being in the home is completely legitimate and understandable given the condition Rebecca was in while still in the hospital. There is simply no evidence that Rebecca had a gun on her or threatened the defendant in any way. Now, regarding the defendant's intent, both John and Rebecca testified to the defendant pointing his .380 Ruger laser at their foreheads. The defendant intended to kill them. Regardless of what he wants you to believe about how this could have just been a coincidence or his laser wasn't working right or whatever he wants to argue about how this coincidence happened, you need to consider that all of these victims were shot in the head with a Ruger pistol with a laser. He intended to kill them. But for Rebecca's ability to turn quickly when the gun didn't initially fire, and the subsequent path of the bullet in her head, the defendant would likely have succeeded in his goal of killing her. But for John's quick decision to flee and the subsequent path of the bullet going through his mouth, the defendant would likely have succeeded in killing him as well. The defendant did succeed in his intentional killing of James Gruettner. James's gunshot wound was to the left side of his head, with the bullet traveling at a downward trajectory to the other side of his skull. This is also consistent with James being shot by the defendant as he was standing next to the white vehicle in the driveway, as John had testified to. Now, the defendant's version of events regarding what happened with James is just not credible either. That James was silently attacking him such that the neighbor wouldn't be able to hear it, and James was repeatedly pushing him, and then rather than running away or leaving the scene or even yelling for help, the defendant, a 20-year Marine veteran who was 39 years old at the time, is so afraid of this older man with a back injury that he feels that he has to shoot him in the head. That is just not believable. The 3 casings and 1 bullet jacket on the scene came back to the Ruger 380 located in Joshua's pocket when he was taken into custody. The bullet removed from Rebecca's head and the bullet removed from James Gruettner's head also came back to the Ruger 380 located in Joshua's pocket. Rebecca and John have provided consistent and credible testimony. They provided consistent accounts immediately after being located separately by officers. They had no opportunity to discuss anything that would be said to officers prior to their arrival. John reports he fled immediately, got a neighbor to call 911. He ran back and said to James and Rebecca, "Help is on the way." He reported he didn't talk to Rebecca. She was in the garage moaning. He testified that he could tell James was deceased. And again, all he heard from Rebecca was her moaning. Rebecca and John did not talk about this prior to officers' arrival. And you saw Rebecca's condition. It is again not credible that she was coordinating a story with John and trying to stage a crime scene while suffering from a gunshot wound to the head. The statements of John and Rebecca are so similar, even though taken apart, that they both mentioned the defendant saying, "Hey," to Rebecca as he walked toward her. Rebecca indicated that the defendant said, "Hey, boo," as he walked toward her. John believed the defendant had said, "Hey, babe." Again, they are located separately, but that detail is also the same. The locations they were at were the same. And their testimony has been consistent. It has been the defendant arrived and almost immediately began shooting at them. Both of them, when they were with officers that night, asked officers to check on other people. Rebecca wanted officers to check on Samantha because she was afraid for Samantha's safety. John was spontaneously concerned about his girlfriend's safety and Julie's safety, worried because the defendant knew where they were. They were scared because they were the victims and they were worried about what the defendant was going to do next because of what he'd just done to them. Neither Rebecca nor John have any reason to lie about what happened that night. John had only met Rebecca a few hours before he was shot in the face. He would have had no reason to get into a fist fight for Rebecca or her father. And he was meeting James for the first time that weekend as well. Rebecca has no reason to lie about what happened. The evidence has shown that she was on her own property with her own guests, engaging in fixing a vehicle she co-owned when the defendant showed up uninvited, drunk, and armed with a pistol in his pocket and a loaded revolver in his vehicle. Rebecca was unarmed and defenseless against the defendant's loaded .380 Ruger, and it was equipped with a laser as well. All of Rebecca's firearms are accounted for as being inside her home that night. Rebecca simply had no access to them. There is no evidence to support the defendant's claim of a conspiracy to lure him into a gun battle so that someone could shoot him for insurance proceeds. That's just such a wild tale. It lacks any sort of credibility. You saw the Facebook Messenger exchange leading up to this. In spite of what the defendant wanted you to believe while he was on the stand, you read his messages. You saw him repeatedly try to get Rebecca to get back together with him. She repeatedly tells him no. He asks to come help with the Tahoe. She tells him no. You heard the text that Julie received from Rebecca. Rebecca told Julie in that text that she had told the defendant if he comes to her property, police will be called. These are not people involved in a conspiracy to hurt the defendant. These are people who are scared of the defendant and want him to stay away from them. The only thing that Rebecca wanted was to finally end her relationship with Joshua Aide and return all of his property so that she could be done with him for good. The defendant was an abusive and controlling boyfriend. He could not accept that Rebecca had made the decision to leave him. That Tahoe and that property exchange represented to him a final end to their relationship. Rebecca intended to cut Joshua Aide out of her life. He could not accept that and reacted violently when Rebecca insisted that the property exchange happen that weekend. There is no evidence to support this self-defense claim. So let's walk through some of the things that we can verify through evidence. The defendant shot 3 people in the head with a weapon that was equipped with a laser. The defendant shot James Gruettner at a distance of at least 5 feet. You heard the medical examiner's testimony. He testified there was no evidence of close-range firing. The defendant would have you believe that James was right in the process of trying to punch him in the face, right up on him. Again, the medical examiner's testimony says no. At least 5 feet he shot him from. The defendant did not render aid to any of the victims after shooting them. Neighbor Ryan said that she locked eyes with the defendant. He didn't wave her down for help. He got in his car and fled the scene. He didn't call 911. The shooting was called into dispatch at 8:27 p.m. by Rebecca's neighbor. The first call shown on the defendant's call log after the shooting communicated with the cell tower in Waupun at 9:06 p.m. He made it from Oshkosh to Waupun in 40 minutes. Now he wants you to believe that he was the sober and rational party when he arrived at Rebecca's house that night. So he's got to explain what you saw in the Greene County video. You saw his condition. He was clearly intoxicated. So he wants to explain his intoxication by saying that he stopped in Fond du Lac, he got some gas, he washed his face, he bought a 6-pack of beer. He did all those things and still apparently made it from Oshkosh to Waupun in 40 minutes. That's not credible. What is credible is the defendant was completely wasted when he arrived at Rebecca's house, and that contributed to his actions that night. He wasn't the rational party. The victims were. Now, the defendant then gets a call from his friend, First Sergeant Peter Bargo, tells him he's just driving home from work. He's then stopped by Greene County deputies. He acts bewildered as to why officers would possibly be at his property. You saw him losing his balance, even stepping out of the vehicle. You heard his slow and slurred manner of speech. When Oshkosh officers made contact with him at the Oregon Police Department, he again denies any knowledge of what's going on here. So as we move forward in this case, he asks his friend Lee to come up with a story about Rebecca to support his self-defense claim and to make it sound good, like he saw the whole thing. None of those actions that I just described are consistent with Joshua Aide being the victim in all this. Those actions indicate that he was a man trying to flee the scene of an intentional crime and ultimately trying to avoid responsibility for a homicide and 2 attempted homicides. Although the state's not required to prove motive, it has been thoroughly established in this case. You've seen evidence of what motivated the defendant in this shooting. He wanted to control Rebecca. He wanted to control her decision to leave the relationship. He wanted to control who came to her house. He even wanted to control how she handled a minor repair on a vehicle she was co-owner of. Again, that vehicle was the final step to Rebecca cutting the defendant out of her life for good, and he would not accept that. So again, the defendant's story is not supported by the evidence. It does not make any sense. And just like he asked Lee Hilgendorf to do, he is now making up a story about Rebecca. So the timeline provides some more information for you to consider. And I know it's hard to listen to our witnesses just go through numbers. So hoping to walk you through this a little bit more. 2:41 p.m., defendant calls John Miller telling him not to come to Rebecca's house. Then he calls Rebecca 2 times shortly after that. Rebecca calls him back at 3 o'clock p.m. 3:18, there's that final text that Rebecca accidentally sends the defendant, her address. Now, there is no reason that the defendant would have believed that to be an invitation to come to her house. He knows where she lives. She'd been telling him all day she doesn't want him. 3:18, Rebecca then says the correction text to her father. Same text sent to her dad immediately after. So it's not a conspiracy by Rebecca to lure the defendant to her house. It was an accidental text sent, a common mistake. 4:06 p.m., Rebecca texts Julie that she told the defendant police will be called if he comes. Again, that's Rebecca and Julie talking about not wanting the defendant at her house. There was no conspiracy to get him there. 4:18 p.m., defendant sends final Facebook message, don't touch the radiator. 4:34 p.m., defendant texts Balthazar, Becky is really pissing me off right now. 2 calls made. First, Rebecca calls the defendant, 8-minute call. Then defendant calls Rebecca, 4-minute call. Then he calls her 3 more times. They go unanswered. He calls her again at 5:08. She answers. 2 more calls to her unanswered. And then they talk again at 5:11 p.m. and 5:29 p.m. is the last call. Now as we move forward from there, these are all the calls where the defendant is repeatedly calling Rebecca. He calls her 31 times in an hour and a half. That's not someone driving along thinking, I want to help you out and maybe pick something up for you. That is obsessive, controlling, outrageous behavior. He was mad. So we get through 31 calls that were made to Rebecca that all went unanswered. We can see that as he's making those 31 calls, on our map, you saw him driving up to the Oshkosh area. Last call to Rebecca, 8:05 p.m., a Fond du Lac cell tower communication. She doesn't answer. 8:27 p.m., Dan Schrader's 911 call comes in. That tells us 22 minutes this man got from Fond du Lac to Oshkosh and completed a shooting in the head of 3 people. That was after calling Rebecca's phone every 3 minutes on his drive up to Oshkosh, where he was coming uninvited. That behavior shows someone who was mad, someone who had a plan. 22 minutes, and they were all shot in the head. Now, when we talk about the way back, we addressed this a little bit, but no call for help, no assistance to the victims. He knows they all have gunshot wounds to the head. His next call is to his friend, Lee Hilgendorf. Same guy that you hear him on jail calls asking to lie about Rebecca. Maybe someone he trusts in this kind of situation. That's a Waupun Tower communication. So 8:27, 911 call comes in. He has booked it back to Waupun by 9:06 p.m. And he wants you to believe that he found the time in there to buy some beer, get some gas, wash his face, so that he can explain why he was so impaired when you saw him when Greene County deputies located him. So the defense has presented this elaborate conspiracy theory where James, the deceased, Julie, Rebecca, and John are all in on this plot to get the defendant into a gun battle so they can get his insurance money. It makes no sense. And it makes no sense because that's not what happened. Now, I'm going to ask you to consider what was going on when the nurse thought she understood what Julie had told her. Nurse calls Julie to tell Julie that her daughter has been shot. Nurse testified that Julie was frantic. The nurse also testified that it's possible she misunderstood what Julie meant. That is what makes sense with what that nurse testified to. There is no indication that Julie ever told anyone that her husband had intended to kill anyone. Julie has been participating in this case. She testified today. She was credible. What she said made sense. She indicated that she did not, I believe she said absolutely not, make that statement to that nurse. Now, Julie's question, what the nurse talked about her daughter being shot, well, we see what's going on from those text messages and what Julie testified to. Julie is sending Rebecca a text saying, "Stop talking to him. Why did you tell him that they were going to be there?" She is scared. She's talking about having a police escort to go and even return the defendant's property. This is someone who knows that the defendant is dangerous. That accounts for the statement she made. The nurse misunderstood what she was talking about. Julie's husband was driving to Oshkosh. That's true. The defendant drove to Oshkosh and shot Julie's daughter in the head. Now, to try to turn a nurse's misunderstanding of what a frantic mother was saying during a phone call where she's learning her daughter shot in the head, to try to spin that into a conspiracy where now Julie's in on this plan to grab the defendant's insurance through a gun battle with him is just beyond the realm of reasonable. What happened here is the defendant was motivated by anger, jealousy, and a desire to control Rebecca. That explains getting in his car to drive 2.5 hours uninvited to Rebecca's house. That explains calling her 31 times over an 1.5-hour period. That explains 3 shots in rapid succession, and that explains his flight back home. This was an intentional act driven by anger, jealousy, and rage. And I'm asking you to find the defendant guilty of all 3 counts charged.